It's 7 p.m. Wednesday, June 26th, here in Seoul.
And these are the top stories at this hour. Just ahead of this week's G20 Summit, President Moon Jae-in says North Korea and the U.S. are in talks on a possible third summit. This through a written interview with major global news agencies. We have his words.
Business tycoons from South Korea and Saudi Arabia sign a host of MOUs worth billions of dollars. This comes as the oil-rich nation looks to curb its reliance on fossil fuel exports.
With hopes of nurturing the service sector, the government announces $60 billion worth of investment in the industry. A large portion of that will go towards R&D.
And pack your umbrellas as the monsoon season is now here. Heavy showers are already drenching the southern regions and making their way up to the rest of the country. News Center begins now. Good evening and welcome to Arirang News Center, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Mohammed.
And I'm Han-daeun. Thanks for joining us. Our top story this evening, President Moon Jae-in has hinted that another North Korea-U.S. summit could be on the horizon.
He denies that nuclear talks are stuck in limbo, rather saying that backdoor discussions have continued to take place since the no-deal Hanoi summit. Our Park Hee-jun starts us off.
President Moon Jae-in says North Korea and the U.S. are engaged in discussions over a possible third summit. In a written interview with 6 international news agencies, including Seoul-based Yonhap, President Moon said it's important to note that dialogue is still taking place behind the scenes between the two countries since the collapse of the Hanoi summit. Moon says this is keeping hopes alive for a third meeting between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump. The president also said the current situation with North Korea cannot be defined as a stalemate, as there have been notable developments in Washington-Pyongyang relations. Those developments include the letters exchanged between Kim and Trump, which show that the two leaders are ready to elevate their level of dialogue. Kim also sent his sister Kim Yo-jong to offer his condolences following the death of former South Korean First Lady Lee Hee-ho. President Moon says that everything has now fallen into place to take the peace process on the Korean Peninsula to the next level. And stepping forward as a mediator, the South Korean president has provided a guideline for the nuclear negotiations. He suggested that North Korea should completely and verifiably dismantle its Yongbyon nuclear complex. He says that could qualify as the first step in the regime's irreversible stage of denuclearization. And in return, the North could see the lifting of some of the sanctions. It's the first time President Moon specified what irreversible denuclearization entails. Also touching upon South Korean-Japan ties, President Moon said that in order to advance bilateral relations, history should not be exploited for political gains. He said his government recently proposed a viable solution to the forced labor conflict, referring to voluntary donations from Korean and Japanese companies to compensate the victims. This proposal was immediately rejected by the Tokyo government. Moon added that he is always open to dialogue with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and that whether or not the G20 Summit in Osaka can help move their relations forward rests entirely on Japan. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in will be sitting down on Thursday with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping shortly after they arrive in Japan for the G20 Summit, which starts on Friday. The presidential office says they'll be meeting at around 5:30 p.m. local time and are set to discuss the Chinese leader's latest encounter with North Korea's Kim Jong-un last week in Pyongyang. As for the rest of President Moon's bilateral summits in Japan, he'll meet separately on Friday with his Indian, Indonesian, and Russian counterparts in between G20 sessions. At the G20, President Moon had been hoping for one-on-one talks with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, possibly to talk about the two countries' dispute over Japan's use of Koreans for forced labor during wartime. But it looks like there will be no such meeting after all. Our Won Jung-hwan has more.
President Moon Jae-in's packed schedule for the G20 summit in Osaka has an unwanted gap. A gap that was supposed to be filled by a meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. According to a senior Blue House official, South Korea proposed holding bilateral talks but heard nothing back from Japan. Bilateral relations have deteriorated sharply since Seoul's Supreme Court ordered Japanese companies last year to compensate Korean victims of forced labor during Japan's colonial rule. Japan has repeatedly called for an arbitration panel involving a third party, to which South Korea is yet to respond. South Korea has also recently proposed settling the wartime labor dispute through a joint fund between companies from both countries to compensate the Korean victims. But this was also rejected by Japan. Observers have speculated that this is the reason Abe has decided not to arrange the talks. But this leader-to-leader meeting was seen as the best chance the two sides had to narrow their differences on the issue.
With diplomacy moving with the Blue House at the center and with all authority given to President Moon, the president needs to be the one solving this issue. We can't say that the top-down approach is the best way, but this situation can no longer be resolved at the working level. The leaders have to meet and solve it.
Observers say that the government could seek to hold a summit after Japan's upper house election on July 21st. This is out of the belief that Prime Minister Abe is unable to be flexible ahead of the election when it comes to the sensitive political issue of South Korea-Japan relations. But the senior official also says the possibility of a one-on-one in Osaka cannot be ruled out completely. If Japan requests to meet on the spot, the official says that the top office will accept. But seeing that sufficient time and preparations are needed for the meeting to provide a tangible answer to the strained South Korea-Japan relations, the anticipated breakthrough could be unlikely, even if an informal meeting does take place. 원정환, Arirang News.
The U.S. has made clear that when President Trump comes to South Korea later this week, he has no plans to meet with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. But there still seems to be hope that a summit will take place at some point. Our Ji-won has the story.
Along with the renewed anticipation of North Korea and the U.S. resuming their denuclearization talks, comes hope for a third Pyongyang-Washington summit. And President Trump's comments to reporters at the Oval Office on Tuesday fueled speculation it might happen sooner rather than later.
Just a nice letter back and forth. He wrote me a beautiful letter on birthday. It was my birthday, as you know, last week. He wrote me a beautiful letter. I thought it was very nice, and just two friendly letters. We get along very well.
No mention of another meeting?
Maybe there was, but we, at some point we'll do that. Getting along very well. He's not doing nuclear testing.
Unlike in the past, a top-down approach is being pursued in a bid to solve the denuclearization issue. And on June 12th last year, the leaders of the longtime foes finally met for their first sit-down in Singapore. There, they agreed on the 4 pillars of establishing their ties and achieving denuclearization. On top of the hard talks, the two leaders also engaged in various activities that allowed them to get to know each other on a personal level, including a one-on-one sit-down just with their translators and a leisurely stroll. But things did not go so smoothly after that, as the two sides faced the critical issue of who does what first and in exchange for what. Despite a number of working-level talks after Singapore, their negotiations hit a wall. And the two leaders stepped in, meeting again about 8 months later, this time in Hanoi. Both leaders seem to have thought they could persuade their counterpart into taking the next step in implementing their deal, but neither side budged. Kim was firm on the U.S. lifting sanctions on the North's economy in exchange for the dismantling of the regime's Yongbyon nuclear facility. Trump said Yongbyon had to be dismantled and the North had to provide an overall and detailed roadmap for denuclearization. Since then, no significant talks have been held, at least not publicly. Whether this week's series of summits between Presidents Moon Jae-in, Trump, and Xi Jinping can revive the momentum for dialogue remains to be seen. But there are concerns that working-level talks need to first pave the way in order to prevent the same mistakes made in Hanoi. Ji-won, Arirang News.
North Korea's foreign ministry has lashed out at the U.S. for continuing what it calls hostile policies despite Kim and Trump's promise to improve relations. In a statement on Wednesday, Pyongyang was referring to the recent U.S. decision to extend by another year its sanctions on North Korea. The North also brought up U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's recent remark that over 80% of North Korea's economy is subject to sanctions. The North stressed that it won't succumb to sanctions and will go ahead with a show of force if Washington tries to trample on its sovereignty. But once again, Pyongyang targeted its criticisms to Pompeo only, not Trump. It said improving relations and denuclearization will be difficult if the U.S. keeps hostile policymakers like Pompeo. President Moon Jae-in and the Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman held a meeting here in Seoul, where the two agreed to upgrade their bilateral cooperation in energy and much more. Our Shin Se-min reports.
President Moon Jae-in and the visiting Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, agreed to expand their partnership in the areas of energy and future industries. During a full-fledged meeting at the top office on Wednesday, the Korean president highlighted the two sides' tight cooperation in terms of trade and expressed hopes of expanding ties beyond their oil partnership.
양국은 기존의 건설 에너지 분야를 넘어서 정보통신기술, 스마트 인프라 등 신산업 분야, 그리고 또 국방, 방산 등 전략적 분야, 보건, 의료, 교육 등 민생과 직결된 분야 등으로 협력의 지평을 확대시켜 나가고 있습니다. 양국 관계를 한 단계 더 도약시킬 수 있기를 바랍니다.
Also, during their series of meetings, the visiting Crown Prince introduced Saudi's reform program, dubbed Vision 2030, which is aimed at diversifying its economy and trying to break away from its heavy dependence on oil. President Moon highlighted similarities between Vision 2030 and his administration's drive for innovation and inclusiveness, saying that the two sides are both seeking ways to move beyond their traditional economic portfolio. He added that he hopes to upgrade the two countries' relations by strategically promoting the Arab country's Vision 2030 as a partner. And the two sides also saw eye to eye on the security front.
The Republic of Korea has made great effort in its confrontation with North Korea, which I highly value.
The Saudi Crown Prince added that the Moon administration's efforts for peace on the Korean peninsula corresponds with the leadership of Saudi Arabia's King Salman. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the two leaders also attended a ceremony earlier today at one of Korea's leading oil refining companies. Kim Il-sung with the details.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and 500 business leaders attended a ceremony to celebrate the completion of new petrochemical facilities by Korea's third-largest oil refinery company, S-Oil. In 2015, Saudi state-run oil company Saudi Aramco, also the top shareholder of S-Oil with a 63% stake, invested $4.3 billion to build a residue upgrading complex and olefin downstream complex in the southeastern city of Ulsan. The new complex was completed last year, but the ceremony was held Wednesday in light of the Saudi Crown Prince's visit, given its symbolic meaning. It is Saudi Aramco's biggest investment project in Korea after it became S-Oil's top shareholder. The new complex will turn lower value residue into higher value added petrochemical goods, 405,000 tons of polypropylene and 300,000 tons of propylene oxide per year. S-Oil says it is expected to help diversify its business portfolio and boost profits. S-Oil and Saudi Aramco also signed an MOU Tuesday to build $6 billion stream cracker and olefin downstream facilities by 2024. Kim Il-sung, Arirang News.
In the latest move to revitalize the Korean economy, the government will invest over $60 billion into the service sector. Our Kim Da-mi has the details.
Calling the service sector a treasure chest for economic value and job creation, the government says it will invest some $60 billion into the sector over the next 5 years. In Wednesday's economic meeting, Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki highlighted the potential of the service sector, which is twice as productive as the manufacturing sector when it comes to creating new jobs. For that, the government will take the lead in extending loans to the service sector by 2023. It will also boost service sector R&D by investing around $5 billion and providing tax incentives. The government also proposed detailed plans for the tourism and logistics sectors. To attract more foreign visitors, Hong announced a plan to host a K-pop festival in May and October every year. Hong also promised to increase the number of logistics centers, especially on unused land in and around Seoul, and invest $176 million in logistics R&D by 2027. He added that plans to introduce smart services that provide customized ICT solutions in logistics will further allow integration between the service and manufacturing sectors. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
South Korea's consumer inflation has remained below 1% since January. On Tuesday, the governor of the nation's central bank suggested that this will likely continue. Low inflation might sound good for consumers, but it's not clear they feel that way about the price they're paying for things they buy every day. Our Kori Ater explains.
Consumer prices edged up 0.7% on-year last month in Korea, which is far lower than the central bank's 2% target. Statistics Korea attribute the sluggish inflation to low domestic demand and the government expanding welfare policies such as free education. Although consumer price growth in Korea has remained below 1% for 5 consecutive months, many say they haven't felt a trend in their everyday lives, especially here at supermarkets. This is mainly because prices of what consumers use and buy every day, such as fresh food and daily necessities, are rising. Data from Korea Consumer Agency, a government organization, shows that the average price of 30 frequently consumed processed foods has been going up in recent months.
I feel like the price of everything has gone up. It's too expensive, especially the things I buy, like rice, anchovies, and fruit. I only buy things that are really necessary.
The price of alcohol has risen, including soju. The cost of drinking has become quite burdensome.
And it's not just groceries. The average price of dining out has jumped as well. The average price of a roll of kimbap was slightly more than $2 in April, which is an increase from last year's figure of $1.90. Kimchi jjigae with rice, another popular restaurant dish, increased to almost $5.50. An expert in the field explained what the difference between real inflation and the inflation that people actually feel means for the economy.
In a situation where consumers feel difficulties affording everyday purchases, but figures show prices aren't high, problems can occur when the government establishes economic policies. For instance, public utility charges can change depending on the consumer price index.
While the government explains it's difficult to completely reduce the gap, saying different households have different expenditure structures, experts say that the difference negatively affects how people feel about their quality of life. Kori Ater, Arirang News.
South Korea's birth rate fell again in April, marking its lowest ever level amid a decreasing number of marriages. The country's statistics agency also said migration within the country declined in May. Yoon Jung-min has the details.
The number of newborns per month hit its lowest level on record in April amid concerns about Korea's shrinking population. According to data by Statistics Korea on Wednesday, the number of births declined 6.1% on-year to 26,100 in April. The numbers were the lowest since the data was first compiled in 1981. The statistics agency said the birth rate has continued to fall mainly because fewer people are getting married. There were 20,000 marriages in April, down 2.9% from the previous year.
The main reason for falling childbirths in April is because the number of females aged from 30 to 34, who are the group most capable of childbearing, has decreased 3.3% on-year, and the number of marriages has fallen for 7 years in a row.
Meanwhile, in another report by the agency on the same day, some 569,000 people moved to other regions or cities within the country in May. That's down 5.1% from a year earlier and the lowest figure since October 2018. Gyeonggi-do Province, Sejong City, and southern island of Jeju saw an increase in population, while 11 other regions or cities lost population, including Seoul and Busan. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Robots are likely to replace 2 million manufacturing jobs by the year 2030. Now, that's according to a report by UK-based research firm Oxford Economics, which estimates that each new robot will take the place of an average of 1.6 manufacturing jobs. About 1.7 million manufacturing jobs have been displaced by robots since 2000. The report says the biggest displacements will take place in low-skilled areas and repetitive jobs, which could worsen social and economic inequality. It called for countries to prepare for automation with policies that include better training and welfare programs. On a brighter note, the report said automation will increase productivity, in turn boosting growth and creating more jobs. It added that a 30% increase in robots installed worldwide would boost global GDP by $5 trillion. Just days ahead of the G20 Summit, Washington is reportedly looking for a solution to its prolonged trade spat with Beijing. Reports say the US is willing to suspend the next round of tariffs on Chinese imports, with the two sides preparing to resume trade talks. Kan Young-woo reports.
With Presidents Trump and Xi set to meet later this week at the G20 Summit in Japan, the US could delay imposing more tariffs on some $300 billion worth of Chinese imports in an effort to restart trade negotiations. Citing anonymous sources familiar with Washington's plan, Bloomberg reported that the move is still being deliberated, but could be announced after Presidents Trump and Xi sit down for a face-to-face on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The report also says U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and his Chinese counterpart, Vice Premier Liu He, discussed an outline of the Trump-Xi meeting in a phone call earlier this week. Sources familiar with the conversation described the exchange as productive, the report added. But a senior U.S. official was also quoted as saying that no detailed trade agreement is expected from the two leaders' meeting. Instead, it could be the goal of the Trump administration to build a more solid foundation for an eventual trade deal after previous negotiations failed to produce tangible results. Meanwhile, the U.S. has concluded government hearings on the proposed extra tariffs on Chinese goods on Tuesday local time. This comes after a week-long series of testimonies by hundreds of companies asking for reprieve from the fallout of the trade war between Washington and Beijing. According to the South China Morning Post, more than 300 representatives from different industries stressed that Trump's tariffs were costing American jobs, raising U.S. consumer prices, and posing a national security threat in some cases. Back when high-level trade talks in May ended without an agreement, Washington hiked its tariffs from 10% to 25% on $200 billion of Chinese imports to the U.S. In retaliation, Beijing imposed its own 25% tariffs on $60 billion of American goods going the other way. Kan Young-woo, Arirang News.
The World Food Program has assessed North Korea's food shortages and concluded that so-called hidden hunger and deficiencies in micronutrients are the real crisis. James Belgrave, one of the WFP officers that visited the North last month for an on-site assessment, wrote on the UN agency's website that the diets of North Koreans are largely limited to rice and kimchi or eggs, far from balanced and nutritious. He said what mothers and children eat during the first 1,000 days from conception to the child's second birthday has a lifelong impact on a child's growth, but mothers struggle every day to find enough food. Belgrave said that regardless of the geopolitical situation, humanitarian work in the North should be allowed to go ahead unimpeded. South Korea's Supreme Court has ruled again that people are capable of working until the age of 65, which will have implications in a wide range of areas. On Wednesday, it ordered a lower court to reconsider its decision to award compensation to a man based on the assumption that he could have worked only until the age of 60, meaning 5 years less income. In ordering that review, the Supreme Court referred to its own ruling earlier this year in which it raised the working age to 65, citing changes in society and the economy. The idea that people can work until that age has prompted other discussions, such as raising the retirement age also to 65. South Korean gymnast Yo Seo-jung is just 17 years old, but she has already had a new vault named after her. The International Gymnastics Federation has added the teen gymnast's vault technique into their scoring book as a new technique worth 6.2 points. Yo successfully managed to perform the vault for the first time at an official competition on Jeju Island last week to make it into the Federation's code of points. She follows in the footsteps of her father, Yo Hong-chul, who won silver in the men's vault at the 1996 Olympics and has two techniques named after him in the scoring book. Visitors can now wear traditional Korean hanbok garments typically worn by the opposite gender and still enter Korean palaces for free starting this July. This means male visitors can wear hanbok skirts known as chima, and women can wear hanbok pants. The announcement was made by the Cultural Heritage Administration on Wednesday after Korea's human rights watchdog said that restrictions on clothing are a form of discrimination. Previously, visitors were only allowed to wear specific hanbok items in accordance to their gender in order to gain free entrance to palaces.
South Korea's terms of trade worsened in May for the 18th consecutive month as import prices surpassed export prices. The central bank says the terms of trade index of products, which measures the amount of imports a country can buy for each unit of exports, came to 90.76, down nearly 6% on year. The BOK attributed the drop to falling prices of electronic equipment and chemical products. Beginning next month, payments for 2 to 3 bed wards in local hospitals will be partially covered by the National Health Insurance, with patients only paying a third of the cost. That would include just over 17,000 wards in more than 1,700 hospitals nationwide. Currently, the National Health Insurance only covers payments for such wards in general hospitals. BTS's latest single, Boy With Love, has gone platinum. The Recording Industry Association of America chose the song in this week's digital singles section for reaching 1 million certified units. This marks the boy band's second platinum certification in 8 months. South Korea's largest annual sports competition will kick off in October for its 100th edition. The National Sports Festival will see some 30,000 athletes compete at dozens of venues across the capital over the course of a week. To celebrate the festival's 100th anniversary, a torch relay will take place throughout the nation, including the inter-Korean truce village of Panmunjom. That has been your 3-minute news flash. It is that time now where we take a look at some of Arirang's digital media content.
And today we have another episode of Kori Ater, where Mike from the U.S. shares with us his experience of living in Korea.
Hey everybody, what is up? My name is Mike from the United States.
진짜 재미있더라고요. 미국 사람입니다. Listening to music. Reading a book.
When I was in high school, my Korean friend invited me to his Taekwondo class, and I was just blown away by what I saw.
Wow.
At that time, my parents were divorcing, and so I needed something to hold on to. So through hanging out with my Korean friends at Taekwondo and eventually going to a Korean church, I fell more and more into Korean culture. I started learning how to read and write Hangul when I was 16.
한국말을 배우는 게 진짜 재미있더라고요.
I started listening to Boa and DJ Doc. So back in 2013, while teaching in public schools in the United States, I learned that there are actually international schools here in South Korea. I instantly applied and started teaching here in 2014.
Now I want to read off the answers to you. Number 1 is 3.
Going through a hakdang during a summer semester. Now in a hakdang, we studied Korean, reading just dialogue out of a book for 4 hours straight, 5 days a week for 2 months straight. We would study one way and then the exam was 10 times harder. This was definitely the toughest experience I have gone through living here in the country. I got married to my best friend. My wife is a native Korean. Her parents wanted to have a complete Korean wedding. So her and I talked and we decided to combine both American and Korean cultures. We had groomsmen and bridesmaids, but I also bowed to her parents. We had both an English-speaking and a Korean-speaking pastor officiate our wedding. So we actually had our vows in English and Korean. Having a beautiful blend of Korean and American culture together showed that our cultures can actually mix into this wonderful combination. I feel we're just one example of how a Black American and a Korean can make it. Guys, thanks for watching. Be cool. Peace.
The monsoon front is moving up the peninsula faster than expected, which has already brought heavy amount of rain to the southern provinces.
Let's get more on the weather from Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle, what's the latest?
Well, the monsoon front started to affect Jeju in the early morning hours and has been moving north since then. Now, this year's monsoon started a week later than average, but it's also the first time in 12 years that the monsoon front has covered the southern regions and the central regions all at once. Now, so far, heavy rain warnings and advisories have been put into effect along the southern coast and in parts of Jeju, which has been getting bucket loads of rain. Now, the capital and the surrounding regions are expected to receive between 10 to 40 millimeters of rain, with much more falling over in the southern regions, which will see up to 120 millimeters. Now, the monsoon front will travel back down to the southeast tomorrow afternoon, so until then, you should hang on to your umbrellas wherever you are in the nation. And meanwhile, Beijing continues to be under scorching hot weather tomorrow. And checking out the readings for tomorrow, Seoul and most parts of the country will begin the morning with temperatures ranging between 21 and 22 degrees Celsius. And the daytime highs aren't too hot either, as Seoul hits up to 29 degrees, and Busan and Jeju are a lot cooler at 26 and 27 degrees respectively. And we have a break from the rain on Friday, but it's expected to return over the weekend. And for the time being, temperatures will stay on the mild side. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That will do it for this edition of Arirang News. Thank you as always for watching.
News in Depth is next.